Bo Nix and Mike Evans are primed to take a step backwards in fantasy points in 2025. We discuss why and hit on 8 other players that will take the biggest falls this season on today's episode of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast. Thank you for making us your first listen every day. I'm one of your co-hosts, Michelle Magdziuk, and when I'm not doing this, I'm a researcher and fantasy analyst with NFL Network.
And I'm your other co-host, Vinnie Iyer, and I'm not doing this. I'm writing about NFL fantasy and betting for sportingnews.com.
Today, we're going to discuss 10 players, 5 each, that we're going to name that we think will take the biggest step backwards in fantasy points from what they did in 2024. On yesterday's show, we did the opposite. We discussed guys that we think we're going to take the biggest leap forwards in fantasy points from what they did in 2024. So we're going to just start right off here with the top guy that we think will, just get worse in production from what they did last year. Vinny, who's your top guy?
Yeah, it's a name that's been very consistent in fantasy football. If you want to count on 1,000 yards and some big plays and some big touchdown games, usually go to the Buccaneers with Mike Evans. Now, he had a big year last year. Let's not kid ourselves. He got into the record books there. He was a number one Bucs all-time type of season for him, just establishing himself again with Baker Mayfield. 2 good seasons with him. He was a wide receiver 9 overall, so in the top 12 as a wide receiver 1, wide receiver 8 on average. Now, Mike Evans used to be quite frustrating because he'd have some big games and he would disappear. He was a little bit more consistent last year. My concern this year is a couple things, that Chris Godwin is coming back into this offense. Number 2 is Jalen McMillan. He came on strong at the end of last season, so now you have 3 legitimate receivers. It's been a while. Maybe you go back to Brashad Perryman when he was doing something here for a short period of time, and he kind of really became a super sub there when Godwin and Evans were out several seasons ago. There was a different team with Jameis Winston. Now you have this team 2 quarterbacks later with Baker Mayfield. Look, it's been really great for the offensive schemes between Dave Canales and Liam Cohen, but now you get to a third scheme. You're going away from 2 guys very bright enough to get head coaching jobs in this league to help other quarterbacks. So you're going to have a little bit of a drain in the usage, and he's getting up there, right? He's slowly putting on some mileage. He's played a lot. He's very durable, and that's what's made him so reliable for fantasy. You can count on him basically to make those big plays, score those touchdowns every single year. He's headed to the Hall of Fame. But again, Godwin was hurt for much of last season. He comes back healthy. McMillan is a legit threat. We'll see if they can develop anyone else behind those guys. But again, they didn't have that number 3 with that kind of dynamic ability for a while. So I think you could see a similar situation to what happened. I'm not going to say it's as drastic, but with Tyler Lockett, kind of with Jackson Smith and Najigba, that kind of development of the younger player and Mike Evans fading a bit. Now, I still think he can finish pretty solid in the 16 range, right? I'll just say somewhere there, 12 to 18, but there's definitely going to be a drop. I think that's more of a ceiling, 12 to 18. I think he's more in the 16 to 20 range in scoring this year.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that make you a little bit nervous about Mike Evans next year. Not that he's going to be terrible at all, but like you said, like Chris Godwin not being there last year was huge. He only played 7 games with Chris Godwin last season, and 4 of those 7 games, these are the points: 5 points, 2 points, 4 points, 9 points. And he did have a few big games in there too with him, but that's where you start to see the inconsistency of Mike Evans when he's playing with when he's playing with Chris Godwin. Now, when Chris Godwin got hurt, he had a lot of big games there towards the end of the year when Mike Evans came back too from that hamstring injury. So that's a big key. I think it's great that you brought up McMillan. Like, yeah, he should take a bigger step forward. And then also Baker Mayfield threw 41 touchdowns last year, right? You can't really expect that. Again, that was such an outlier year for him. And if he goes down in touchdowns, maybe Mike Evans, instead of scoring 11 touchdowns, scores 8, right? I really like this pick. He was definitely in consideration for me to pick him as well. But my top guy here, I'm going with Bo Nix. It's not because I think he's going to be a disaster in year 2 or anything. I just don't think he's going to put up the production that we saw from his rookie season. He finished as a quarterback 7 overall, quarterback 9 in average. But that last game really did skew some things, right? When you're only in a 17-game sample size, one game can kind of mess with the numbers. And that last week 18, when most people don't even play fantasy, right? He got to face the Chiefs backups, right? Like no starters were playing. They're resting everyone that mattered at all. And he threw 4 or 5. I don't remember, but he scored 30 something fantasy points. Weeks 1 through 17, it already goes down by a whole point per game. So weeks 1 through 17, you scored 17.5 points per game. And then when you include that week 18, it goes up to 18.7. So right off the bat there, you can expect a downfall. But then also his home road splits were scary. At home, he averaged 21 points per game. Away, 16 points per game. So that's something you have to worry about. And then also just, teams having more film on him. And the Broncos also haven't, loaded up on skill players for him. They brought in Evan Ingram. I don't know if that helps him when it comes to passing touchdowns. And then it's just, I just don't think he's going to be a top 7 quarterback. Maybe top 12, but it's right there on that edge for me when it's like 12 to 15.
Yeah, and these quarterbacks in the back half tend to fluctuate a lot here. I mean, there are always surprises, and we saw him. We saw Sam Darnold, some of these surprises, even Baker Mayfield. We just mentioned him shooting up there. Now, we like a lot of other guys we've talked about. Trevor Lawrence is one of our big risers. Caleb Williams, Justin Herbert. There's just a bunch of guys, Matthew Stafford that I mentioned yesterday as well, where these are all headed upward, and there's going to be guys that need to fall down so those guys can take their place, and that's just a natural order of things. And those touchdowns are pretty fickle for everybody. It's not just running backs and wide receivers. Touchdowns combined can go pretty much up and down unless you're one of the elite, super elite, consistent guys getting it on the ground or through the air, right? If you're those guys, you're going to always get those big numbers and they might even go up. But here you have a rookie that, again, sophomore slump could happen. They also could be a lot more efficient with their running game this year for Sean Payton. That would help. Obviously, their offense and chances of winning overall, but that also could shrink Nick's numbers. And then you look at Nick's, he also did some running to pad his stats. You can't always count on that either. That's also a pretty big variable for one season next. So I like that pick a lot from you.
Who is your second guy that you think will make the biggest fall?
Well, this one, I took the low-hanging fruit here. It's Jonnu Smith. I just had to mention him. I'm still dumbfounded to see where he finished last year and how many times we were skeptical about playing him. But he finished as a tight end 4 overall, tight end 6 on average. It was a little bit of a crazy year, right? Travis Kelce down a little bit. Brock Bowers had his emerging season. We saw Trey McBride, but up there we had David Njoku. We had Taysom Hill, had some explosive games to be in the scoring conversation. And then he had Jonnu Smith. So these, I think all 3 of them are outliers, to be honest. But I just went with the guy that's highest in Jonnu Smith. Let's hope this is the case. Like, I don't foresee this offense only exploding again for Miami. But I also think they're going to get their receivers a lot more involved, their wide receivers, and Devin Achane out of the backfield. So I just don't see Jonnu Smith having this type of an impact for a second straight season in this particular offense. If he does, I don't think it's a good sign overall for Miami's success this season.
Yeah, if Jonnu Smith is a good fantasy asset again, where he's consistently like getting targets, that's not good for Tyreek Hill. It's not good for Jalen Waddle. It's not good for Tua, and it's not good for the Dolphins. That offense was not good when they were giving Jonnu Smith 10 targets a game. So yes, I am definitely with you there. And then my second option, I'm going with running back Joe Mixon. It just doesn't, there's not good vibes with the Texans right now, right? It doesn't feel like their offense is going to be electric like we thought going into last year. They are dealing with Tank Dell injury. It's really just Nico Collins, Christian Kirk. Yeah, they traded for, but I do think the offensive line, like they haven't put in much work to fix that besides getting rid of Larry Tunsil, which I don't know how that fixes anything. And we saw the drop off at the second half of last year too, right? And it could have been age. He turns 29 years old in July. That is kind of the time where running backs start to fall off. But last year he finished as a running back 13 overall, running back 9 in average points per game. But from weeks 1 through 11, he killed it. He was so good, averaging nearly 22 fantasy points per game and half PPR. Like he was thriving, 121 scrimmage yards per game, 11 touchdowns he scored for the first weeks 1 through 11. And then weeks 12 through 18, the wheels just completely came off. 8.5 points per game he averaged, 60 scrimmage yards per game, cut in half, and only 1 touchdown. Again, I just don't think the Texans offense is going to be scoring a ton of points for him to get into the end zone. So I do see a fall off for Joe Mixon, maybe being more in the running back 20-ish range where he's a fine low end RB2, but I'm not taking him, trusting him to be like a top 12 running back this year.
Yeah, you just really were surprised by his production last year. I'm really surprised the way they just kind of gave him the ball a lot and he broke down eventually. And he's getting older. He's had a lot of mileage as well through his days and now 1 year in Houston. So, I, yeah, he's not a guy that I'm going to be pounding the table to draft. I think there's going to be a lot of other options. Now, Najee Harris appears like a better option. Ashton Genty. There's going to be different guys that are going to pop into that range at running back that are much better targets that you look at over an aging Joe Mixon. There just simply are. And then we'll see Christian McCaffrey rebound potentially here if he's fully healthy. A lot of guys. Breece Hall I mentioned as a potential riser. So there are a lot of people that could easily displace Joe Mixon. And I think Mixon could also see a decline in production. So it's a good start. I think I'm really excited to maybe talk about our next few followers. I wouldn't say excited, but I'm glad to share that information with you guys in the next segment.
Yeah, we'll get to that. We have a couple more quarterbacks we're going to talk about, another 2 running backs and 2 wide receivers. So lots more to get to. We'll take a quick break and then jump into that very shortly.
All right, it's March Madness. We know we're into the Sweet 16. And FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's 200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories, and even who's cutting down the nets. Right now, Duke would seem to be the favorite, and I actually like them as a bet this week going into the Sweet 16. They're playing the 4 seed Arizona. They're 9.5 point favorites. The total is also 153.5 points. I like the over. I like Duke in this game. 2 high scoring offenses, Duke with a little bit better defense, and the Duke offense is red hot with Kyle Proctor. So I like this team to take care of business and move on to the Elite 8. You can get in the action in your own way by checking out the spreads, totals, and game props. And the tournament games are going to be happening all throughout the weekend. You got Sweet 16 all the way to the Final Four. So there's always going to be something new to bet on. And the FanDuel app is simple, easy to use. And when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. You still have a few more rounds to get in on it. That's only at FanDuel.com. All right, Michelle, it is time to continue our show with another significant faller, and we're finally going to mention a wide receiver from you.
Yeah, I'm going with Jordan Addison, wide receiver 20 overall last year, wide receiver 21 in average points per game. There's a lot of things that were working for the Vikings offense last year. Sam Darnold randomly throws 30 touchdowns. They're thriving. TJ Hawkinson misses half the year and then comes back slowly, which allowed Jordan Addison to get more targets. But then also it was just a few games that really, really brought up Jordan Addison's points, right? He had that 3 touchdown game in week 14. He had that 162-yard game with like a 70-yard reception, receiving touchdown in week 12. Week 4, a nice solid game with 72 yards and a touchdown. But besides that, the rest of them were not great. They're all under 16 fantasy points. 8 games out of the 15 he played were under 10 fantasy points, so more than 50%. So it was really those 3 games I mentioned at the beginning here that really skewed his numbers. That's hard to trust that he's going to have those monster games with a change of quarterback, right? And JJ McCarthy. And yeah, I think sooner or later, he's going to be the better option than Sam Darnold. I think that's the right choice to go to. But it's really not fair to expect him to throw 30 touchdowns in his first year in the NFL. And Jordan Addison scored 9 touchdowns last year, scored 10 with Kirk Cousins the year prior. I do see that probably going down. TJ Hawkinson got 0 touchdowns, right? And only 62 targets. So I do think Hawkinson could steal some of his targets, steal some of his touchdowns. And then at the end of the day, it's just not going to be as good as it was last year.
Yeah, you could see some shorter passing to Aaron Jones. You could also see leaning a little bit more on the run with Aaron Jones. They did upgrade their offensive line. That should give you an indication right there with Will Freeze and getting Ryan Kelly as well. They kind of swapped out Garrett Bradbury, so they're a little bit stronger with their run blocking. So I would say they want to be a little bit more balanced. They've tended to be pretty pass happy, but they've also had veteran quarterbacks to execute the offense for Kevin O'Connell in both Kirk Cousins and Sam Darnold. Right now, they're basically essentially working with the rookie J.J. McCarthy, and they're kind of non-committal right now. Everyone's wondering what are they going to do? Are they going to add another quarterback? Daniel Jones is gone. They're not going to keep Nick Mullins. He's gone. So they need to figure out something here. They don't really have a contingency plan for J.J. McCarthy, but I think to get him kind of warmed up, they need to lean a lot on the run a little bit more and maybe not trust him to throw downfield as much and be as aggressive. So that's going to hurt, I think, Addison. Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, they'll be fine because they can be schemed open. But a player of Addison's caliber and a little bit younger, I think, could be held in check. So that's a good call by you. Now, this is one of your favorite players, Michelle, so I'm sorry that I'm bringing him up here. But it's Kyren Williams, and this comes down to one of our favorite fantasy buzzwords with him. He was the RB8 last year on average, RB7 overall. It is the touchdown regression. Everyone loves to use that phrase. Now, he's denied this fact twice now with big years into the double digits. Will he score double digits again? I mean, they use him a lot at the goal line, so there's that. But I think I mentioned it with the Matthew Stafford spike. Hey, if he's going to get a few more touchdowns to Devontae Adams and Puka Nacua, they have to come from somebody, and it's Kyren Williams. So again, maybe I'm going back to what I was thinking with Mike Evans, a few fewer touchdowns, and then that can change the course of your scoring a little bit. And keep in mind, each touchdown is equivalent to 60 yards. And he's not a big-time pass catcher, so you lose a touchdown, that's 60 yards, 6 points, and all of a sudden you can drop a little bit if you kind of rack them up because you just need to get 3 of those touchdowns, and that's one less game of production if you look at it with 18 points. So there is really a path to having lesser points if you don't get to those 12 to 14 touchdowns. And I think that's going to happen. I think you could still get 8 to 10, right? That's fine. But that's still 30 points off the board potentially for not a big pass catcher. I've always liked him a little bit more in standard leagues, but yeah, Kyren Williams, I just don't think he's going to finish that high. Again, I mentioned all those running backs who are going to push down Mixon. I think they also play a part in dropping Williams to maybe a high-end RB2 this season.
This will be the first one we disagree on, but I don't think you're shocked by that. Kyren Williams, I can't get off that train, right? He just gets too much work. Sean McVay leans on him. And I do think Matthew Stafford throws more touchdowns this year, but I just think overall the offense will score more touchdowns. So I don't necessarily think that means Kyren Williams has to get any taken away. Now, in offense, I think we'll take a step back slightly is the Lions. So I'm going to put Jared Goff here. It's kind of like your Jonnu Smith. This feels like a really easy one, right? Jared Goff finished as the quarterback 6 overall, quarterback 7 on average, but it was a very outlier year for him, even with Ben Johnson, right? Even with his years with Ben Johnson. In 2022, he scored 16.7 points per game. In 2023, 17 points per game. And then last year, it went up to 19.1 points per game. Now, he played a ton of games inside, right? In the dome or in nice weather. And this is why we really liked Jared Goff going into last year. Now, he outperformed even what I thought he would do. But now this year, that's just not the case. His away schedule is all outdoor games in the cold. At least half of them are going to be because these are all cold areas in Chicago, Green Bay, Minnesota. Well, Minnesota is indoor, but Washington, Philly, Cincy, Baltimore, Kansas City. And then the one warm area is the Rams that he'll be going to. But I just think there was already an outlier year. We saw him do this in 2018 at 19.4 points per game with Sean McVay and then fall down to 15 points per game in 2019. So we've seen the fall off. He lost Ben Johnson. I don't think it's going to be atrocious, but I think he's going to go back to what he used to be around the 16 to 17 point per game mark, which is going to put him as a quarterback 12-ish instead of a, top 6-7 guy.
Yeah, and it's really hard for these guys to maintain a floor that are not the running quarterbacks. I mean, Baker Mayfield helped his ceiling last year by running. We talked about that. But if you can't run, you get basically 0 from the ground. It really is dependent on those touchdowns and making sure you're throwing for 5,000 yards or close to it to really get the big numbers. And it's really hard to duplicate that from one year to the next. So I like your Goff called. Mine is very similar to yours, except he's on a different team this year. It's Sam Darnold. And we look at Geno Smith, that big year, right, where he was a surprise, one of those surprise top 12 passers. Then he dropped off significantly to get out of that range last season. So now it's a different offense, different weapons there in Seattle. I know he's a good fit for what Clint Kubiak wants to do. He was with Kubiak in San Francisco that one year that Darnold was the backup there. So there's some familiarity with the offense, much like Josh McCown was as in to the Kevin O'Connell Vikings offense last year. So there is a little bit of familiarity, but there's definitely a change up here. Look, I don't know what you're going to get from this combination of Cooper Kupp and Jackson Smith-Njigba. I think they're going to be good, but let's just say this. I think Stafford is going to do a lot more with Nakua and Adams than Darnold does with this duo. I just think he's got to get used to them on the same page. And keep in mind, none of these guys are at the level of Justin Jefferson, right? I mean, Cooper Kupp might have been just a few years ago, but he's not that player anymore. JSN is a very good producer, but he was a complimentary guy. They had to pay attention to DK Metcalf last year, and it really started opening up things for JSN. So will that happen again? Will all those things come together? Does he have the potential to have another 30 touchdown season on a different team? I mean, that's all really hard to project. And again, not a guy who's going to run and give you numbers that way. So he's really dependent on getting settled and doing that. I also think sneakily the Seahawks offense is going to be a little bit more run oriented than we think. I think Kenneth Walker is going to be busy in this offense, and they're going to try to take pressure off Darnold. So I don't see the volume. I don't see the touchdowns. And I think the unfamiliarity with the situation is going to bring him down a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a bad wake-up call for Sam Darnold. I think he enjoyed his 1 year in the NFL, but then unfortunately the Vikings already had a young quarterback that they're going to go with. You lose Justin Jefferson and Kevin O'Connell, he's going to go right back to what he was. And then also, like, you have to consider how many times he had such easy opportunities to score because the Vikings defense just kept putting him in amazing situations with turnovers. So unless the Seahawks defense does that for him, which maybe they do, it's going to be a massive fall off for sure. We have one more guy each to talk about that we think will make the biggest falls in fantasy points come next year. We'll get to that right after a quick break. All right, Vinny, let's finish up today's show. We're talking about the biggest fallers that we expect from 2024 to 2025, guys that we think are going to take a step back in fantasy points. Give me your last guy here, Vinny. Who you got?
Yeah, to avoid getting tomatoes or anything thrown at me, I've saved him for the last segment. And I was wrong on Saquon Barkley last year. I didn't expect him to explode this much. But again, when you join a great offense like the Eagles, you have potential to do that. But he was worked in this offense. And we've talked about this. I mean, he could be like Derrick Henry and kind of defy the odds a little bit. But that's the only recent example of these rushing champions coming back and delivering. We've seen the attrition that Josh Jacobs, Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor have had the following year. You just can't load up a back with that many carries again and expect him to be A, as effective, and B, stay healthy. And you want to keep Saquon Barkley healthy. So I think the Eagles might be a little bit more proactive in that situation, right? I think they'll just try to preserve his body a little bit. They have a pretty good young guy rising behind him and Will Shipley. So they do have a little bit different type of depth with Kenneth Gainwell gone. So they're going to look to maybe ease the workload a little bit. I'm not saying that drops his production much, and this is why he's in the last segment as the guy that's going to drop. I don't think it's a stretch to say the guy that finished first in fantasy scoring is not going to do it again, right? I mean, that's just what history tells us here. It's very hard to duplicate that level of production from 1 year to the next, especially when you have high volume, and you're just going to have a little bit of regression. And keep in mind, it wasn't just high volume through the season. He was getting a lot of work through the playoffs, through his birthday when they won the Super Bowl. So I just say you just have to know that's going to come down. Where do I think he's going to fall? It could be RB5, RB6. But still, that's enough of a fall where, look, if you're weighing him versus other running backs, that could be just enough to make you decide to go in a little bit different direction, whether it's choosing a different running back in the elite position or just going to a different position altogether.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of 60-yard runs he broke off last year, it's going to be really, really, really hard to repeat. So, yeah, you're not saying he's going to be bad in the slightest, but the likelihood is that he drops off. Now, Drake London, I went with him again. I don't think he's going to be bad, just like your Saquon Barkley. It's just he finishes the wide receiver 5 overall last year. And a lot like what I was talking about earlier with Bo Nix, with that huge Week 18 game, that's exactly what Drake London had, right? He had a 36-point game in Week 18 against the Panthers. Terrible defense. And that skews things greatly. From weeks 1 through 17, he averaged 12.2 points per game in weeks. And then when you include that Week 18, it goes to 13.6. He had a whole 1.4 points per game that's added on to his score because of that Week 18 massive performance. And it's not fair to just take it away from him, but then also Darnell Mooney didn't play in Week 18. So that is saying something. He got 18 targets in that game, and it was because he was pretty much the only guy there. Now, Michael Penix Jr. is coming in. We don't know what he's going to look like in his first season. Yes, 2 of the 3 games he played with him were great. He had over 100 yards in 2 of them. But most of the year, it was pretty mediocre. He had a couple big games, but also 7 games under 10 fantasy points, or actually 8 games under 10 fantasy points. A couple more 12-point games, a 13-point game, a couple 15-point games. Like, it's really just 2 big games on the season that's really bumped him up. And then also the fact that he played the 17 games that made him the wide receiver 5 overall. So I do expect a drop off from him. He got 158 targets last year. I don't know if that's going to happen again. He also scored 9 times. I don't see that type of line from him again. I think he'll be fine, just not top 10 wide receiver.
Yeah, I mean, if you give me a while to say who is the overall wide receiver 5, like I would take a long time to mention Drake London was him. But you're right. I mean, the numbers can lie, and the average scoring is something you have to look at. Where does the scoring come back? That's why you could look at the game log. What's the consistency? When did it happen? Did it happen because of a player injury or something anomalous, like facing a favorable matchup in a meaningless game, right? So all these things can come into play here, and you just have to say, who was this player really, right? Was he the player that is going to explode like that in the final week? Or is he a guy that, okay, he's going to see a reasonable amount of targets. He's more of a 6 for 80 guy with a chance to score, right? And I think that's where Drake London kind of falls. And look, Darnell Mooney had a pretty good year. Penix is still getting used to things here, but he did have that good connection with these receivers last year, at least in a small sample size. So there are some positive things, but I don't think the Falcons really want that to happen again. That means their defense stunk and they had to throw too many times. So I think you'll see a little bit of correction with Bijan Robinson. They got Mooney. We'll see what they do with Kyle Pitts yet again. So I think by default he had to be, but I think things are going to change here where I see him dropping down more into the wide receiver 2 range, more where we had him high-end wide receiver 2 in the pre-ranks. I think he just outscored that quite a bit because of certain circumstances, including one massive game at the end.
Yep, absolutely. That is going to be it for today's episode. I want to thank you all for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. But for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that the season is over, get the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every day. Find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Vinnie and I will be back tomorrow talking about more fantasy football goodness. We'll talk to you then. Bye, y'all.